Mark Rowland, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here, Lewis.
How common is burnout compared to other mental health disorders that you focus on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, technically, burnout itself is not considered a mental health problem. So it's a sort of precursor to sort of occupational hazard. It's a precursor and increases the risk to other mental health problems. The experience, depending on how you cut the data, Lewis, the experience of being like overwhelmed by stress is very common. We did a study a couple of years ago asking exactly that question, and we found that 3/4 of people have been overwhelmed by stress and anxiety in the last year. So it's a kind of common human experience. We also know from a recent study on burnout that Mental Health UK did that, 91% of people said that they experienced some element of burnout in their jobs. So it's a really common experience. I think the question is how the extent and the time and the intensity of that overwhelm is really important in terms of its overall impact and whether it then goes on to cause the damage and the risk it causes to people's lives and to further mental health problems.
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's a sort of different distinctions between levels of seriousness it feels like you're pointing to, and there's a stress, burnout, maybe more serious mental health disorders like depression. Is there a kind of continuum, and how serious when compared to what are maybe considered more serious mental health disorders is burnout? Where does it sit in that seriousness spectrum?
Yeah, I think its basic impact can be extremely serious in terms of degrading someone's ability to be resilient and be able to cope with life. And it's a gateway to then experiences of depression, anxiety, even the experiences of psychosis and other serious forms of mental illness that can have long and enduring impacts. So, it's a bit like asking how serious is being burnt by fire. And, you can be burnt by fire by scolding yourself, you withdraw, you recover quite quickly. But you can also have lifelong scarring impacts if you're seriously at third-degree burns, where you're not able to escape from that kind of exposure. And so the psychological risk and the psychological impact really depends. It can't, it shouldn't be underestimated. It's a psychological hazard that is cited by the health and safety executive that employers have a legal duty to protect you from. So if you equate it to physical hazards, you wouldn't be expected to be put in physical danger, and you shouldn't be expected to be put in psychological danger. And burnout is the manifestation of repeated stress. I mean, I see burnout as being the gap between the demands that are consistently placed on you and your time and resources to be able to meet those demands. And if that is out of sync, you're going to be paying a psychological toll.
Right. The fire analogy is a great one. I didn't know. So employers have a legal obligation to prevent burnout. Is that right?
They have a legal obligation to address and identify psychological hazards in the workplace. So that could be excessive demands. That could be unfair treatment, discrimination. And so there are three key elements that go into the experience of burnout, especially if you're talking about workplaces. One is an appropriate level of autonomy that an individual has in their job, the level of fairness that they experience, and I'm going to come to what's the third one. So it's like autonomy, fairness, and the demand of the job itself. So the actual job role. So if you can have two or three of those and it still experiences burnout, but the health and safety executive holds employers to account to say they've got to do an audit of psychological risks as well as physical risks, and they hold those two in tension. You've got to have a plan to respond to those.
Right. I think many people might be watching this and think that the idea that an employer maybe more careless employers care about employees' mental health doesn't seem to be something that is it is widespread in the world, let's say. And I think, pointing to the difference between physical health and mental health, that the physical health is so much more objective. We can see it. It's unignore. It's on the surface. So is there an issue here where mental health is a bit more hidden, a bit more subjective? One man's hard work is another person's burnout. Is that an issue?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think there are two pieces of really important sort of legislative frameworks around that relevant to burnout. The first is the Health and Safety Executive and its requirement on employers to identify psychological risk. And the other is the Equality Act, which gives people protection in the workplace, especially from discrimination. And mental health is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. And you are then obliged to offer reasonable adjustments to employers who are experiencing mental distress or mental ill health. And the rub comes around reasonably. And I think that's a really important conversation for workplaces. And as the chief executive of a mental health charity, we have those conversations internally. It's not a simple calculation because you're still asking people to do a job. You're paying them for that job. But you are also required by law to make reasonable adjustments for someone who's experiencing mental ill health and to protect and support recovery. So it is a big political conversation because a lot of the productivity problems that the current government are trying to solve are driven by mental ill health. And there is one school of thought that's trying to gaslight a whole section of society and being told that your distress is not real. You just need to get back into work and stop being a snowflake. So that there is a complexity around mental ill health that doesn't quite neatly equate to physical health. And I think the key for that, Lewis, is that there are no biological markers for mental ill health that you can read. You can't do a blood test and go, yep, definitely depression. It's all about what you're manifesting and experiencing and and the ability of an external party to assess those symptoms. And that does mean that it's a more complex arena and one that needs to be handled with sensitivity, but where the biggest potential gains are for employers who really understand and invest in the benefits of a mentally healthy workforce. Right.
Yeah, I think we'll return to that issue because I find that interesting. Those two bit that legislation you pointed to, do you see that as working?
Well, they are big step forwards that we have made over the last 10 years. And so they aren't the only tools in the toolbox, but they are really important in their progressive piece. The fact that the Health and Safety Executive didn't used to acknowledge psychological risks was amazing. It was almost as if because you can't measure it or see it, it didn't exist. So how many employers are living up to those standards? In terms of, so the legislation itself is good. The compliance to it and the consistency of employers is a massive issue, and there's widespread non-compliance, and so the enforcement, I think, is the real issue rather than the legislation itself.
Right. Yeah. In your role and from the position of Mental Health Foundation more broadly, what do you see as the root causes of burnout? Is it as simple as overwork, or is there some more nuance in who experiences it? Where do you see it the most? Where is it most a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, I think of it in the causes it in two domains. There are the external drivers of burnout, which I alluded to earlier on, which come around your job design, the demands of that job, and so the job design, the demands of it, the autonomy, and the fairness. If you and broadly speaking, if you're in a job where you're treated unfairly, you have no control over that job, and there are excessive demands being placed on you in terms of your time and resource, almost anyone is going to find that hugely stressful, and that's going to lead to burnout. So I think there are some things that are baked into the human condition which make being treated unfairly, not being able to deliver against unreasonable expectations, and having low levels of control, that shouldn't be considered an illness in terms of responding to that, or some sort of weakness. Human beings are designed psychologically for community and protection and belonging, and when that is systematically undermined, you will find a big psychological toll. So the first set of external drivers is fairly consistent. We're all in that boat. None of us, and actually this is where it comes to resilience is quite interesting, because with burnout, sometimes the most resilient, the people who believe that they can cope with that, end up creating a bigger problem downstream than the people who are saying, this is not reasonable, I need to get help or get out. So there is a fairly universal reaction to those external drivers, and the extent of those is really important, and the length of time in terms of its impact on you. I had an experience recently where I was speaking with another friend of mine who was a chief executive of another charity, and they were doing a merger, and he was effectively being pushed out of his organization and taken over by another against his will, and but then being made responsible for all of those decisions back with his organization. And he was someone who he was being treated unfairly, as excessive demands in order to get the merger done, and he had no control. And this was an individual running an organization, but ended up in secondary mental health care, having an acute psychotic episode and suicidal. And he hasn't returned to work. And it's been many, many months. So the idea that this is something that is casual or not to be taken serious, I think is really misplaced. So those external pressures, I think are the key drivers, and being able to spot them. The other side of the coin is, what are the internal drivers within us that also expose us to risk of burnout? And as I say this, it's really important that we don't get into victim blaming. No one who is experiencing burnout, it's not their fault, it's not personal weakness. But part of self-understanding is understanding what are the beliefs that I hold about the world and myself, which may make it more likely that I tolerate unacceptable behavior, or I don't seek help early enough. And so we can see from the research literature that personality traits around perfectionism, high internal standards, or, for example, inadequacy, imposter syndrome, mean that people work harder for longer, accept conditions that are not acceptable, and then they suffer the consequences in terms of the psychological toll. So when you get the perfect storm of external drivers with internal psychological realities which prevent you from seeking help, you're in a whole world of problems.
Yeah, there's so many things that you said that resonate with me. One of the reasons why I'm so interested in this is I'm certainly not as burnt out as many people seem to be, but I've noticed many things about the setup of my work life that I find interesting in relationship to burnout. One of the most interesting things is that the autonomy and control thing you talked about. My life being on YouTube, a lot of people look at that and see it as the kind of ultimate form of being able to control your life. You can, when people look at a self-employed person, they think, oh wow, you're so free to work in whatever ways you want or whatever hours you want. And the reality is obviously is often the complete opposite of that, in that my schedule and what I work on and how I respond is completely determined by sort of algorithms and data and this stuff I'm looking at all the time that's completely outside of my control. So it leads to a kind of franticness and a kind of insecurity and precariousness that I've noticed has, has sped up the hamster wheel. I have an element of perfectionism, high standards and idealism, which I think contribute to that. And then the other point I'll just make quickly there is that I feel like as the world has become, the acceleration of globalization over the last kind of 30, 40 years has led to a feeling that more things are out of people's control, whether that's supply chains, whether that's contracts being more open to flexibility. All of that is to preface this question. Do you see something about how the world has changed in the past, I don't know, pick your number, 2, 3, 4 decades, whatever, that has contributed to the rise in this?
Yeah, and I think you can really see that in the wider data around mental health problems, not just in the UK, but globally. You've seen infectious diseases plummet. You've seen deaths before the age of 5 fall, numbers of people dying in global conflict. It's actually a pretty good century. But chronic ill health has sped up, and mental ill health is sort of on the vanguard of that globally. And you can see the graphs have a marked increase. And the Lancet and others have done a sort of global commission looking at some of those key drivers, and they find that their sort of supposition is like there's 4 key drivers that are behind that rise. And I think a lot of them key into this feeling of uncertainty and unpredictability. Like, we just can't handle that very well as human beings. And when you look at the way we've evolved, it's very different from the kind of context and lives that we, for most of human history, have inhabited. Albeit our lives were a lot shorter because but we just haven't had to survive so much uncertainty multiplied by isolation. Like, it's all on you, Lewis. No one else is going to run this podcast. No one else is going to pay your mortgage. So it's the singularity of responsibility multiplied by the uncertainty and the variability of the outcomes that could possibly be available. You could get superbly rich, or you could find yourself penniless. That is a relatively new psychological experience that we're having to navigate in the broadest picture. That sense that we are, where previously we were in a context where we had a shared sense of responsibility. You were your brother's keeper. And I don't want to idealize the past, but there were some psychological realities. And here's the trade-off, and you mentioned it. The reason that we don't all live in hunter-gatherer communities today is because of the trade-off between freedom and uncertainty. So we've basically gone for the freedom option, which brings some benefit, but we're reckoning with the uncertainty that gives us, because we're standing alone with multiple outcomes, and that is very difficult for many people to manage, and it's totally understandable.
Right, so true. Yeah, one of the things that's come up for me in my research of the kind of history of mental health is this idea of kind of linear security. Like you say, sometimes we want to jump outside of that security and innovate and have freedom. But there are certain institutions and mechanisms and cultural phenomena that provide kind of linear security for us traditionally. And I think of, for example, I don't know, guilds in the past. You might work for one guild for your entire life, but your profession would be protected, so there'd be some predictability. And I think of unions and the decline of unions, over the past 40 years, again, there was some linear security in that, and they've been replaced by a kind of flexibility, a quick moving around, open to contracts, open to revision. That is to say, I think a lot of people have noticed, maybe since COVID and probably before, that mental health professionals, healthcare workers have kind of become more political. And in a lot of research, I remember criticisms of, say, the Lancet during COVID for getting into politics. And there's this kind of shift, I feel, towards an acknowledgement that you can't avoid the political if you're going to talk about the causes of these things. You can't avoid the economic.
Yep.
You can't avoid the cultural.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Do you think you have to?
No,
you have to engage with that?
Listen, that's why mental ill health is so fascinating for me personally, because it is profoundly personal and deeply political. The big drivers of mental ill health. And this is one of the big reframings. Like, if you experience mental ill health, if you experience burnout, one of the big messages is not just on you. It was originally framed, like mental ill health was originally framed through the medical model, like it's a malfunction of your brain. Your brain's not working, you have a serotonin deficiency. All of that has been largely debunked. There isn't really, there are some genetic drivers, but actually, we like to ask not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you. That's a much more helpful framing. And what has happened to you is a direct result of how we've structured society and the risks that we're putting in place to that people are routinely facing. And so if you've got a context of high inequality, we've seen the psychological impact. If you prioritized an economic system which disproportionately rewards some and penalizes others, that comes with a psychological consequence that we're reckoning with, and we've really seen that through Michael Marmot's work on health inequalities, especially in terms of its impact on mental health. So there's almost no part of the way that society functions that doesn't have an impact on mental health. And part of our work is saying, actually, if you want to address the mental health crisis, unfortunately, it's not just going to be about more talking therapies and more mental health services. It does require a cross-government approach to say, let's address the risks at a systemic level. And you won't be able to prevent all of it, but at least you would be doing the moral and ethical job of preventing distress where you can. And that's a really big part of our work, working with governments in all parts of the UK. Right.
So, I mean, I hesitate to ask you to put a percentage number on it, say, but would you, if you said a large portion of your work is working with governments, what percentage would you say that is? Like, how important, if you could put a number on it, how important is that?
I mean, it's I would say about a third of our work at the moment. A third of our work goes on working with communities, supporting communities at risk. A third goes on research, and a third goes on advocacy. I was with the mental health minister last night, and was hearing that the government has really got a focus on the prevention of poor mental health, which is a big focus for us. And I said to a minister, that's really it's great that that's the aspiration. But while we speak, the actual national resource for organising and coordinating efforts within regions to prevent mental health problems, the number of staff we have in England working on that is zero. And it's been reduced from zero. It's been reduced from a large team of 25 professionals to zero. So we have a social problem that is 23% of the disease burden, and zero staff being employed by government saying, how can we prevent and address all of the pain and suffering that comes with with this. And so that was a really good example when I got of our work where it at least we're in the room and at least we can hold the government and ask the questions to say, well, where are you placing your resources? Because there's one thing, it's one thing a government saying, well, we don't care about mental health. At least you know what you're dealing with. I think if you've got one saying we do care and we want to prevent it, but we're not following through on the resources, then that needs to be called out.
Yeah, it's so easy for politicians to say one thing and then the details of policy to get lost in the news cycle. You said 23% of the disease burden comes from mental health. That's such a huge number, and it seems so contradictory and backwards not to understand from a business owner or a governmental point of view that we're so focused on productivity, a productive society, as you say, for many good reasons. But it seems so backwards that if you want to increase people's productivity and well-being and energy levels, that would be the first thing you'd tackle. You wouldn't reduce it to zero. You'd increase the numbers working on it. Surely, is there something wrong in my picture of that? It seems so self-evident to me that you'd focus on that.
No, and the entire political system, as we know, is a short-term game. You've got a 4-year election cycle. Some of the big societal problems that we have, including mental health, are intergenerational and long-term, and so it's that basic political incentive often undermines. Prevention is like the dog that never barks. Everyone talks about it. No one's willing to invest in it. And I think, but the potential gains are huge. And you can see that internationally with the countries that have invested it. Even when you do the international comparisons of where we spend money, we spend much more of our public sector money than other countries on treating and responding to the problem than we do on health creation, keeping people in work. Other countries do put more money into that sphere. It's called, health generation is a part of public health. It's called salutogenesis. It's putting in place the environment that people can flourish in. And like you say, it's not a simple science, but there's massive payoffs. And in the end, I'm a firm believer that you get healthier people, but you also get a higher performing organizations and teams where there's psychological safety. That's what the data shows. Where there's psychological safety, guess what?
Yeah,
people
surprise.
Actually flourish.
All right. Yeah. Health generation. That's a phrase I've never heard before. But yeah, that's a great phrase. We often think of health and illness as something to be tackled once we succumb to the problem rather than prevented in the first place. Which country would you say does that the best?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's changing and evolving, but the Scandinavian countries, the social democratic countries, they've got a very good reputation for sort of working life balance, and their workers' protections are really strong. Their breaks and holidays are really strong, but they're also more progressive in terms of some of their policies around the criminal justice system and how you respond to, because there's a big link between mental ill health and the criminal justice system. There's a massive link there. That's effectively what we do with individuals whose mental health is suffering. A lot of men act that out. They're not able to articulate the distress that they're experiencing, and it often acts out in terms of antisocial or violent behaviour. But New Zealand and Canada have also got very progressive policies. We're in Wales at the moment. We've just brought over what they call a stepped care model from Canada, and the idea there, Lewis, is crazy. The idea there it's revolutionary. Is that you give access to people at the point of need. There's no referrals. They're treated like a whole person, and you get a sort of, it's like a single therapy model where you deal with today's problems, whatever that is, and you're led by the person, not by the problem. You're not waiting for a diagnostic label. You're just saying the person's got a problem. How can you signpost and respond to that? And so there are some really interesting models in like that. I think if we can integrate into the UK, use technology in a smart and sophisticated way, I think there are some real potential gains for helping to support people in the context they are in. Right now in the UK, slight diversion, but in the UK, you are 8 times more likely to wait more than 18 months for mental health care than you are for physical care. So 8 times more likely to wait 18 months. And it's no surprise what happens to your mental health if you're waiting for 18 months. And it's not just you, it's all the people around you that are absolutely tearing their hair out waiting for support. So we do need a reboot of the system. But yeah, there are some really great models. Iceland has paved the way and shown some fantastic examples since the 90s of their ability to put in what we call sort of preventative public mental health policies that look at parenting support, look at provision for young people's hobbies, but also bear down on antisocial behaviour. And they've seen a real turnaround on issues related to stress and substance misuse and antisocial behaviour, which have got fantastic results.
Right. Some people might be watching this and say, everything you said is all well and good, but we just don't have the resources. Keeping people alive, when they've had an accident or they have cancer is more important. Do you think this is primarily a resource problem, or is it a cultural problem of understanding? Where would you point to as the biggest kind of roadblock here?
Yeah, it's a great question.
It's a difficult question as well. I'm sorry, because you immediately get political again.
Yeah, I think this week the NHS is about to publish its 10-year plan, and prevention is going to be part of it, a big part, and a shift into more community-based approaches. So I think a big problem is the politics over no one votes for prevention because it's not there are more important fires in the house that need to be put out immediately. So I think there's a political problem. The resources is a problem where you've got stretched resources and not enough to meet the demand. People are waiting this today. How do you take some of that and put it into prevention? But actually, the resources necessary are not huge. It's not, and will save money over the long term. So I think, as the government has done in terms of its approach to infrastructure investment, we're calling for a separate category of investment spend. You've got capital spend on buildings and infrastructure. You've got everyday expenditure, and we want to see a budget line for long-term preventative public health initiatives that is protected and say, okay, it's not a huge amount, but it's going to pay off really big in the long terms. And I think having some really boring systems architecture that protects expenditure for this kind of work is what we need to stop it getting sucked into the tyranny of the urgent over the important.
That's a wonderful phrase, and that's so true that you save money in the long term. It's an obvious place to allocate funds that will, if as you said, it's responsible for 23% of the disease burden, then if you don't do it at the beginning, you're just kicking the can down the road. So it seems like a no-brainer. The logic seems impeccable that you just, especially if it doesn't cost you much, that you just spend the money. But there seems to be a political blockage somewhere in how that message. Yes, there must be people that disagree with that. If numbers of reduced to zero rather than increased. You know?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the problem, the big challenge is the speed of change, that it's just not possible for people to, and also the attribution. It's difficult if you put in family hubs in communities, sure starts, if you invest in increasing access to nature, if you increase anti-bullying programs and invest in those relatively small sums, there is a challenge, Lewis, about attributing those initiatives with an actual reduction in prevalence of mental ill health, and that so it involves a multi-agency approach. So the things that we know work, especially in the workplace, but the same is true in communities and wider government, is it's not one thing that's going to bring the prevalence of mental ill health down. It's when you bring together a number of different factors. So in the workplace, that involves culture. It means pay. It means looking at working practices. It means how you monitor that and report on it, and the sort of psychological safety element on it. It includes role models who talk about their mental health, but it can also include how you do your business and being willing to look at the actual business model and saying, is there something about the way we're doing our work that we need to do differently? So we know that line manager training, for example, is absolutely key. So I suppose my message there is that it's not been done because it's impossible, but it is difficult, and it involves more than the NHS,
Right. We talked about the politics a little bit, and I feel like you can't disentangle the politics from the media. I've realised it's been a while since I've heard the term mental health crisis in the news cycle. It seemed to be kind of a hot button issue, maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago. And you do obviously hear about it every so often, but it seems to be, and I wonder if you might keep, is there a link between this and the politics and the economics of it, that the nature of the news cycle makes it difficult to talk about these issues over the long term, and certain political issues are a lot more quote unquote sexy? War, the attention economy that will just push these sensationalist stories. Do you think that's a big part of the issue?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing, as a really insightful point, we're definitely seeing a pushback. I mean, I started this job in 2018, and I was previously working in international development, and I came into mental health, and it still felt like it was a massive deal when the royal family spoke for the first time about their experience, or members of the royal family spoke about their experience of mental health. It was a big news story. Now we are seeing much more of a critique and a pushback that we've had too much talk about mental health. We've over baked the cake, or whatever the souffle analogy is, and so the critique is that we're creating demand by talking about it. We're turning everyday problems into sort of pathologies, and that we and that almost we need to sort of put the genie back into the bottle somehow and contain this and make it a small problem again. And we the health secretary a few months ago openly, basically said that we've gone too far. So we're definitely experiencing some fatigue around talking about mental health, and people wanting to change the conversation, so that's a big challenge.
Sure. Yeah, I think of my own experience of that. I think burnout seems different because it's you can't disconnect it from your work context, that there are clearly bigger structural work issues at play. What do you make of that critique, though, that maybe not that we need to put the genie back in the bottle, but that I've read some, as I understand it, reasonably serious people who said that concentrating too much on certain issues does make them worse. And my own experience is that actually certain things, when it's not very serious, maybe like anxiety, maybe like stress, you can over intellectualize it. You can focus on it too much. And I've, for me, I've noticed that if I don't ignore an issue, but rather than concentrate on it, do other things to switch off, get outside, whatever, that's a better way of responding to it. But also that you do need to kind of work through these things and do the hard work and experience and intellectualize and think about it. Of course, but that maybe there's a point where you have to go, okay, I'm putting that aside now.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair reflection. And, I think there's a big difference between putting something aside intentionally and saying, I'm going to stop either analyzing it or obsessing about that issue. If you decide to do that that's part of self-care. There's a difference between that and the decision to ignore it, deny it, or dismiss it. That's never going to make the problem better. So I think that self-awareness about what is helpful for you, I think, is part of the maturing conversation. We're not necessarily about more and more awareness. We're about better awareness leading to effective self-agency and action, as well as systemic change that reduces the risk for us to all be super uber mentally healthy and agile, like sort of ninja mental health warriors, in order to just cope with living in the modern life. It shouldn't be that hard. So we're saying some of the systemic drivers have to change, but at the same time, we do know that there are the basics of our psychological or coping mechanisms that we're often getting wrong. Many of us are making the problem worse by the way we respond to it, and that is something that we need to have a sophisticated conversation about how to manage our mental health in a sustainable way. And some of the nuance you talk about, I think, is exactly where the conversation needs to be.
Because a lot of this is structural, I think I get the sense that a lot of people feel helpless, unable to affect any kind of change, fed up with politics, etc. What do you think, if you could, sum up and give one message to quote unquote ordinary people that would help this in some way, what would that be?
I personally think, Lewis, that understanding your own inner life and how you can support good mental health and that journey towards it, I think it's the most exciting and important journey we all go on in terms of our human experience. And I think there's a massive loss if you live your whole life and you haven't engaged with how could I reduce the things that are making me anxious, and how could I find a place of more energy and joy in my life. So I think the number one thing I would say to people is to be courageous, to turn and look at the things that is causing pain. There's a way to understand mental ill health is that your brain is telling you something that is wrong, that needs to change in your life. You may not have all the power and resources to change it, but it's trying to tell you something. It's a warning sign. It's on your side. So listen to that and then decide how you're going to respond. What can you do with compassion to yourself? A couple of weeks ago, my sort of father-in-law, 80 years old now, but, he went to the doctors for suspected memory loss. And actually, what they found out was that you haven't got memory loss. What you have is underlying anxiety that's very persistent. And here is a man who said, okay, I'm going to go to therapy, age 80, and I'm going to look at those causes of anxiety. And I thought, that's incredibly inspiring at one level, but also a salutary tale for us to say, let's turn and face these things where they're causing a problem. And there's a lot of hope that you can, I know, I've seen it, you can make progress.
Yeah, that's a great message. And I think on that note, we'll leave that there. Mark, thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lewis. Yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation.
Me too. Cheers.